So let's get started. So it's our pleasure to have Professor Anna Gilbert, who's at Yale, and she'll be telling us a little bit about metric representations. So please take it away.
Okay, I think we tested everything. So I think we should be good. Can you guys hear me? Yay, okay, great. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. And we're in this weird period of this pandemic where at least I personally am not sure, do I want to travel for work? Am I even allowed to travel for work? Will my university reimburse me, etc.? So I appreciate in this period being able to do a hybrid talk. But I wish I could be there in person. The good news is that Rishi Santalia is at the Simons Institute, and I think I can see him in the. Yes. Okay. Hi, Rishi. Okay. So this is joint work with Rishi Santalia. He is now at UCLA. This work was done when he was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and I'm going to talk about how to represent data.
That just got much quieter.
I'm sorry, what?
Your mic cut out for a sec or something. Now we're
okay. Okay, I'm trying to do this from home with a stable internet connection. So we'll also see if my dog makes an appearance. Okay, so right, so I'll just jump right in. If you are handed a bunch of data and it's noisy or it's been corrupted, or you are given distances, say, between data points, and all those values are wrong in some way, the picture that you're going to get of your data can also be quite distorted, and it might give you a completely different view of the world, so to speak, depending on how correct or incorrect you've represented your data or the distances amongst your data points. And so this talk is about partly how to repair this information, and also how to get better representations of distances and metrics in your data. Okay, so the first example that I'm going to show you is an example to get you thinking that, yes, this actually could cause all kinds of problems. So, suppose I take the Swiss roll data set, it's ostensibly, it's a manifold, right? It's all rolled inside one another. And let's say I've got 2,000 data points, and I use those data points to compute distances amongst all of them. And I get a pairwise distance matrix. And suppose that I add some noise to the pairwise distances, not to the data themselves, but to the distances. And, suppose I add noise, some amount of noise, to just only 5% of the distances. So 5% of the entries in my distance matrix is going to be corrupted. And then suppose I use that corrupted distance matrix to construct let's say a 30 nearest neighbor graph, right? So, I'm going to put edges, amongst nearby nodes, and the edges are going to have edge length corresponding to the distance, supposedly, between the nodes. And I'm going to do a little thought experiment where I take a clean version, and then I take this noisy version. Now, what I end up, what I am going to try and embed into 2 dimensions is this nearest neighbor graph, one which is nice and clean, and the other one which has roughly 8%, 9% of the edge weights just completely perturbed. So, the edges and the vertices are exactly the same. It's just that the edge weights are perturbed. And I use both of these as input to isomap. Well, the figure on the left here shows, a nice curve, a nice projection of isomap. Everything is nice and preserved. The geometric structure is nice and preserved. But when I give what I think of as ever so slightly perturbed or corrupted distance graph to isomap and I do the embedding, I get just utter garbage. And so this is an example to show you that if your input to something as simple as isomap, it's actually MDS, underlying under the hood. If something as simple as a very basic, very old algorithm like MDS, or even something not quite as old as isomap, if your input is corrupted, it can make a huge amount of difference in the output. And so it behooves us to represent our data or our distances accurately with a metric, perhaps denoised in some sense. Otherwise, all sorts of downstream tasks are just garbage. Okay, so I got interested in problems like this after listening to many talks on single cell sequencing data analysis and sort of bioinformatics more generally. A lot of the kinds of data sets that folks were interested in analyzing in single cell sequencing were very large and quite sparse matrices that were of the form, number of cells. This might be 10,000. These days, it might be on the order of 1 million by genes, let's say 10,000, 20,000 genes. And many of the entries in this matrix were 0. Now, it's not known whether they should be 0 or whether just the depth of the read wasn't good enough. So I guess what I should say is what each entry in this matrix is the number of times this gene was expressed in this cell. So it gives you sort of a snapshot of the gene expression in a population of cells. And what a lot of the bioinformatics questions or algorithms people were trying to use, what they involved was converting this matrix into distances between cells. So putting this information in cell space to try and cluster cells, try and classify them, try and figure out what are various marker genes for different types of cells, trying to determine sort of what is the sequence of, what is a developmental trajectory of, either an organism, like an embryo, or, some sort of organ system developing in an embryo. And, who knows how correct or incorrect these distances in cell space really were, because all of these values are potentially corrupted, and they're also possibly too low because all of these entries, many of these entries are 0 or they're small. And so this is really where I began to get the idea that if these distances are not correct, how can you possibly have any sort of guarantees on your algorithm, downstream that you're going to run it on? How do you know that these cells are clustered together when, your idea of who's close to one another is just garbage? And so I thought, really we should come up with some algorithms that capture with much greater fidelity the salient features of the data, so that these machine learning algorithms further downstream would be much better. And so, there's going to be some trade-off in how do you exploit the very specific geometry of, let's say cell space in which we represent the data, and how much, what kind of features you can get for your learning algorithms. Okay, I see a hand raised.
Hey, yeah, do you hear me if I just yell?
Yeah, kind of.
Though the session chair is graciously giving me the mic. Okay, it was seemingly important on your previous motivation slide that you talked about making the perturbations on the distances themselves rather than the perturbations to the locations of the points, because the latter would still preserve a metric. It would just be a slightly messy metric.
That's correct.
But this second thing you're talking about, it looks naively like it's more like perturbing the locations, because if I view the row of your matrix as specifying a location, and then you say, well, a bunch of these entries of the row are corrupted, that's like saying I moved the cell in the cell's location if the coordinates of location are genes, right? So somehow it feels like, yeah, can you clarify this? Like which of these noise models, it seemed like it makes a big difference which noise model you think about.
In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I guess what I'm going to say is that the single cell data is so sparse that any of the robustness guarantees for isomap, or sort of how much noise you can add to, for example, data that you run through isomap, they just don't work. It's just too much noise. Also, it's not the same kind of noise. These are essentially they're zeros. It's like eliminating a bunch of coordinates. So it is the case that with this amount of missing information in the matrix, the distances actually do fail to be a metric. I mean, they do. If you do something stupid like a L2 distance, the values that you get out don't satisfy triangle inequality. Okay. Somebody.
Wait, that doesn't make. I mean, if you view the rows as vectors in a vector space, then they sort of have to, as vectors in a metric space, they have to, right? I'm a little confused.
Hang on a second. Something is going wrong with my computer. Hang on. Okay, now I have lost my slides. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so yes, I frequently get this question, but hey, wait a minute. The function that I use to compute these distances, it's still a metric. In this,
I'm imagining distance is literally like L2 distance between these rows. Is that right?
Yeah.
If I made that distance.
Yeah. So, typically people, they'll do all kinds of crazy hacks to come up with some number here that actually makes any sense. If you were to just blindly do some kind of L2 distance, and wherever you have zeros, you just make it a zero. It's not going to make any sense at all.
Okay, the point is that if you use L2, which would make it a metric, it's just that it's going to be a very crappy metric. Like this metric is not useful for understanding your data. So you have to do something else to denoise it, but now you're not really going to get a metric.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about a couple of families of problems that sort of all fit under this rubric. I called this metric learning, knowing full well that it's sort of an overloaded term, that it refers to some specific problem. But I would like to make this a much more general problem and say, look, we're going to look at three different kinds of metric learning problems. One of which is in the spirit of the original version. So the first one is metric nearness, which is given a set of distances, find the closest metric to these distances in some LP norm, closest in L1 or whatever, L2. And so this is a setting where the input to the algorithm is a set of distances. They may be corrupted, they may have been corrupted in some way, they may be completely inaccurate values, etc. So the next version of the problem that we tackled was correlation clustering, the idea of partitioning nodes in a graph according to their similarity. You're given nodes that are similar and nodes that are dissimilar, and you are supposed to partition the graph into two clusters. And then metric learning, where you're given data points and you're given information about those that are similar and those that are dissimilar. And you want to try and find a metric which is as consistent as possible with this similarity or dissimilarity information about the data. Okay, so these are the three types of problems that we're interested in tackling. I'm going to give some precise definitions now so we can set up the statements of these problems. I have a distance function. I guess this should be from x cross x into r. It measures how far points are from one another. I could alternatively represent that in a matrix, capital D, of pairwise distances. Sometimes I operate on a graph G, which is a weighted graph, which is induced by the data set where the weights are the distances amongst the data points. And I'm interested in finding metrics. So I'm interested in the combinatorial object, the metric polytope on n points, as well as its projection onto the coordinates that are given by the edges of some graph G. So the metric polytope and on n points and the metric polytope, that's the projection onto the graph G for these n points. And it's important to observe the generalization of the triangle inequality for a generic graph is a cycle inequality or cycle constraint, if you will. You should have no edge in any cycle that is heavier, i.e. is longer than the sum of the edges in the rest of the cycle. So, the standard triangle inequality, the triangle is the cycle, and you have no edge longer than the sum of the other two edges in the cycle. And to observe that the metric polytope induced by the graph G is given by an intersection of half spaces, potentially a lot of them, depending on how many cycles are in this graph. Okay, those are the objects under our study. And now I'm going to talk about specific problem formulations of these various types of metric learning problems. So this is in a slightly different order than I gave first, sort of easier to understand. So correlation clustering, I'm given a graph G and dissimilarity measures on each edge, plus and minus, and I want to partition the nodes into clusters so as to, if you will, sort of minimize the mislabeling of edges. This is a hard problem, and so we'll relax it to putting weights on edges and minimizing the discrepancy of the lengths. I guess I should say lengths instead of weights. I think of these as weights. Minimizing the discrepancy of the lengths of the edges, discrepancy with the similarity and dissimilarity information. And I want those lengths to obey a triangle inequality. So no longer are they simply 0 or 1, the partition, but they must obey a triangle inequality. The metric nearness problem is easier for me to state in terms of the objects that we defined previously. So for the metric nearness problem, I'm given a matrix D. It is an n by n matrix of distances, and I wish to find the closest metric to those distances in some LP norm. So I wish to minimize the LP distance between M and D, where M lies in the metric polytope on n points. Okay, now I put in red a couple of different variations of these problems. I put them in red because they are not convex variations of this problem. I could ask, what is the closest tree metric to my given data? Or what is the closest delta hyperbolic metric to my data? Those are interesting questions, but they don't fit this nice form. I will talk about them at the end. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a question about
Yes.
this correlation clustering? So your decision variable XC is defined on the edges. So it sounds like you're just classifying whether the edges are within the clusters or across different clusters.
Yes, that's the original version with the 0-1 weighting, and that's not an optimization problem I wish to solve. Or I guess I should say it's not one I wish to attempt to solve. So instead, I'm going to relax it to something much more reasonable. And I want to put distances on the edges.
Right. So I guess my question is that you're saying your goal is to partition nodes into clusters, but it sounds like you only classifying the edges.
Well, how about putting distances from clusters on the edges?
I think the question is just in the original problem formulation, is there a requirement, like not the one you're going to solve, but in the original one, is there a requirement that these 0-1s are consistent with some underlying clustering?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I should be careful because the information that you're given is just, you know, positive and negative on an edge. And, you know, saying these two vertices are positive and these two vertices are negative.
But you're supposed to output a clustering.
What?
But you're supposed to output a clustering.
Well, I am supposed to output a labeling on edges, either 0 or 1. You know, 0 meaning, you know, the two edges that, the two vertices that are on this edge are you know, either depending on what your meaning of 0 and 1 is. Let's say they are not in the same cluster, and then the other version is they are in the same cluster. So I don't know whether or not you want to call that a clustering because it's not actually a labeling of vertices; it's a labeling of the edges.
Okay, it's a little confusing because somehow, like then it seems like you trivially just you break it, you put a label on the edge to be 1 if, you know, W plus is bigger, and an edge to be, and you make it 0 if W minus is bigger or something. And I just don't even pay attention to whether I've consistently done anything to the vertices.
Yeah, but you're summing all these up and you want to minimize this quantity. So you want to find the labeling 0 or 1 that minimizes this sum.
Okay, I think it's not so important for the next part since you're not going to solve this anyway. So maybe I'll
No, no, I don't want to solve that version.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay. Yes, there are many complaints one could make about correlation clustering. Okay, so here's a general version of the original metric learning problem, which is you're given two sets of pairs of data points. The first set of pairs is those that are similar, and the second set is those that are dissimilar. And you wish to find a metric that has small distances, you know, between those pairs that are similar and large distances between those that are dissimilar. So one very natural objective function to try and optimize says, you know, look, I have some weight lambda. I wish to find the metric m, you know, that puts similar points close together and puts dissimilar points far apart. And I have, you know, this weight lambda and 1 minus lambda over here. Now, the original metric nearness paper said, hey, you know, look, this problem is too hard to solve. So instead, what we'll do is we'll try and find what is essentially a reweighting of Euclidean space. You know, let's just find a diagonal quadratic form that goes in between, you know, those various quadratic forms for Euclidean space. And, you know, essentially we'll just learn this vector. It's just a reweighting of Euclidean space. But we actually want to solve the much more general problem. You know, what is the point in the metric polytope that minimizes this objective function? Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you in setting up these problems that there's actually a very general problem formulation underlying all of these families of problems. And it is of the following form. Let me minimize, or give me the point that minimizes some, I'm going to say strictly convex function f over, let's say, the metric polytope that corresponds to the projection of the graph G. G might actually be the complete graph, in which case the metric polytope is exactly the same. And I might also throw in some additional constraints. And I'm going to throw in the additional constraints, in this form, AX is less than or equal to B. The reason why we allow for these additional constraints is, like, for the correlation clustering problem, these variables might be in between 0 and 1, not just any sort of value. Okay, so we've got a strictly convex function that we wish to optimize over a convex set, and subject to some nice-ish inequality constraints. Okay, so we called this type of problem formulation a metric constrained problem. Now you want to optimize some function over metrics, over the metric polytope. And how do you do that?
Can I just quickly ask one very, very brief question?
Yes.
So I think it's related to some of the questions that were asked before, but you're framing the problem just purely in terms of the edges, right? Like in some of the original motivations you talked about, there's also like the X's had, they were actually points that were drawn like plus 0, 1s or whatever in the cell type thing, but you're going to completely ignore this and only think of distances. Is that okay? All right, cool. So there's no operational interpretation we should assign to the nodes except through the distances.
Nope. The reason is that a lot of existing methods would try and do things to the data points. I mean, all kinds of imputation methods would try and fill in the zeros, for example, in the single cell data matrix. And we didn't think that was maybe necessarily such a good approach, especially since many machine learning algorithms would convert the data into distances and run from there. So that's why we took that approach. Okay, so a lot of existing constrained optimization problems, a lot of existing methods for constrained optimization problems with lots of constraints. For example, order n cubed constraints for just simple triangle inequalities. Possibly exponentially many constraints if you're looking at sort of ensuring that no cycle has a heavy edge. Existing methods for trying to solve these problems don't scale particularly well, or just far too many constraints. And a couple of the sort of standard techniques to circumvent these problems themselves would have problems. So if you wanted to just sample the constraints sort of in every iteration, it would take a lot of iterations to get through all n cubed constraints, and it would take a while to visit them enough times. Lagrangian formulations don't help also with these scaling or convergence problems. So Rishi came up with an algorithm called project and forget, which it's a nice take on sort of active set methods with a clever use of an oracle. And it's an iterative method for solving these convex problems subject to metric constraints. So it consists of 2 steps, project and forget. And so the project step is simply a Bregman projection. And it's done in such a way that it doesn't have to cycle through all of these constraints. And then there's a forget step, which says, look, are there any constraints for which we haven't made any updates? And if there are, then just forget them because we've already satisfied them and we can move on. So we have analysis of this algorithm under I think the appropriate mild hypotheses that this algorithm converges to the global optimal solution. And with one or two more, I think, reasonably mild assumptions on the objective function, we can get an exponential decay rate asymptotically for the error. What's also kind of nice about the proof of the convergence is that you can see that the set of constraints at the end, when the algorithm terminates, is exactly the set of active constraints. So I won't go through the proof of the theorem, but I will discuss the ideas behind the algorithm itself, and then I will discuss how it performs in practice on a bunch of different examples and how it led us to more generalizations and actually one of its forerunners. Okay, so I will also say there's a stochastic variant. I won't say too much about that. Okay, so what does the algorithm look like? Well, you know, while you're not done, project. Oh, actually, wait, excuse me. While you're not done, get a list of constraints that are violated, i.e. get a list of metric violations. This is the Oracle piece, and I will discuss this more in detail in a second, but let's just say we've got some Oracle that returns a list, a pretty good list of constraints that are violated. We throw that list into our current list of constraints that we need to do something about. We project onto, we do a Bregman projection onto the hyperplanes defined by those constraints. And then we look to see, is there anything that we didn't update? And if so, forget that constraint. And so you can see, these pieces down here. This is the Bregman projection. This is the forget step. I'm trying to think what comes next. Okay, so I should say that this assumes that this Bregman projection is easier or worse depending on what the exact form of the gradient of f is, and what this analytic form is. This is written so as to assume that you have all that information, but there are ways around that if you don't. Okay, so what's the separation oracle for this algorithm? So, the number of constraints that you have in order to satisfy a metric, especially with these graph cycle things, they may be just, incredibly numerous. There may be far too many. And so just simply writing them down even possibly might be computationally infeasible. And so the only way that you can access them is through a separation oracle. And basically we have a deterministic separation oracle that will return a pretty good list of violated constraints. And it's pretty good in some technical sense. They can't be too far, maybe, from being violated. And then there's a stochastic version of this. We just replaced deterministic with a randomized version. Okay, so what's an example of such an oracle that has this property? Well, it's one called it's called metric violations. But essentially, it is to run a shortest path algorithm on all of the graphs, on all of the edges in the graph, and if the length of the edge between node I and j is greater than this shortest path, then you have a violated constraint, and for most. So that's the separation oracle, and now I'm going to let you guys think about how to prove that proposition. Okay. All right. Usually when I talk about this, sometimes I get a question about Bregman projection. Hopefully I explain that a little bit while walking through the pseudocode. Okay. So this is a summary of the results of the theorem. I said, with mild, I think, assumptions on the objective function and, how are the hyperplanes arranged with respect to this objective function, then the algorithm converges to the optimal solution. If you know something about the objective function, like it's twice differentiable and at the optimal solution and it's Hessian is nice, then you can get a convergence rate for this algorithm. And also the proof reveals this nice active set idea. Okay, theory is great, but how does it work? Like, does it actually work? So I'm going to go through a couple of examples. A couple of example problems and a couple of the, sort of the state of the art, at least as it was 6 months or so ago, a year ago, for these problems. And a couple of them, we worked with the folks who implemented these state of the art solvers. And I want to emphasize here that we did not do any sort of special implementations for each version of the problem. It's actually quite a generic implementation. So, the goal was to show that this is quite a powerful technique, not, that we could tweak it to do this and that and that. Okay, so the first problem variation that we looked at was weighted correlation clustering. And here, these are for dense graphs. As you all may know, solving shortest path problems makes a big difference whether the graph is sparse or dense. So David Gleich and his student at the time, Nate Velt, had nice implementations for solving this dense graph, weighted correlation clustering. And they showed that, just sort of out of the box standard solvers like Garobi, can only tackle about graphs with about 4,000 nodes. And this was a few years ago, so I don't know how reasonable size machine this is right now. So Velt in his thesis developed a method for solving graphs with roughly 11,000 nodes by transforming to a slightly different LP, slightly different optimization problem. And this is the version of the problem that we solved. Here, I've got the complete graph. This is the metric polytope on the complete graph. This gamma here, I believe, controls the approximation factor to the optimal. I'll have to go check on the next slide to see if that really is the case. But we really wanted to compare apples to apples and solve the same problem that Velt did. So we took 4 graphs from the Stanford Network repository and compared the running time, quality of the solutions that we got, and how much memory we used for the same graphs that Velt did. So when they did the implementation, Gleich and Velt added someone else, Ruggles. So it's Ruggles et al. And we took the same 4 graphs that they did. These are dense weighted graphs for correlation clustering. Here we get up to 11,000. So, our running time is considerably faster. Our optimality ratio, again, this is how it's controlled by gamma, is better, i.e. we're getting a more optimal solution, a less bad approximation to the optimal solution than their implementation. The only kind of funny thing that's going on here is that the average memory usage per iteration, their algorithm does better. So we went to go investigate this. This seems kind of strange for an algorithm that is supposedly some sort of active set method that is ejecting constraints after they've been satisfied. So it turns out indeed that is what's happening, and just computing an average memory usage per iteration doesn't really show what happens over some number of iterations. So, after about 10 iterations, project and forget has sort of settled on the number of constraints that are sort of needed to get to the optimal solution. It starts out with a whole bunch of them, and pretty soon forgets all of them. And so, on average, though, this is kind of high, or makes for kind of high memory usage, but you do get this kind of performance. You can also see that the maximum violation of the metric constraints is decreasing as we go, which is as we expected from theoretical analysis. Okay, dense graphs are one thing, sparse graphs are much different. So we took a bunch of sparse graphs, which were huge. One of these sparse graphs has 130,000 nodes, which one would think would make for roughly 10 to the 15th metric constraints. And in 120 some odd hours, we were able to solve the weighted correlation clustering with pretty decent optimality ratio. And in fact, actually only, let's say, roughly 600,000 active constraints and 193 iterations. So way beyond the realm of what Gleich and Welt and Ruggles could do. David Gleich actually was so excited about this that he interviewed us in the middle of serious lockdown pandemic, and he recorded it and made this really nice video, and it was actually really cool. Like, he really wanted to know, how did we do this? So it was kind of neat. Okay, so the next problem that I'm going to talk about is a metric nearness problem. And the reason why I included this one is not because the problem in and of itself is so interesting or so important, but sort of where you can go from here is really interesting. And it's actually this is the problem that got me thinking about this area sort of originally, as well as sitting through a bunch of bioinformatics talks. So just to remind you, you're given a matrix D of distances, and you want to find the closest metric, closest in some LP norm, to the input matrix. And this was originally stated and sort of solved in a paper by Brickell and Trop and Dillon in about 2007. I think it was originally part of work that Joel Trop did as a graduate student. They came up with a couple of different methods for solving this problem for p equals 2, I believe, and also I think p equals 1. The important part is that they did 2 kinds of experiments for weighted complete graphs. They took random binary distance matrices and random Gaussian distance matrices, and then tried to find the closest metric to those random matrices. And so, just for the sake of comparison, we looked at, the average running time of our algorithm versus Brickell's. I believe that this is Rishi's implementation of Brickell's algorithm, because I don't think there is one sort of publicly available from that long ago. But Rishi, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. All right. Basically, this is like saying, look, we're slightly fast. We're faster for these types, for type 1 and type 2 graphs. Okay, so I have just a very few minutes, and I wanna talk about a couple of other directions that A, we went in, and B, sort of inspired this original work. So the first one suppose you want to find, the first one is a sort of a sparse metric repair version of the metric nearness problem, and that is replace this P norm with the L0 pseudo norm. So give me the fewest number of changes that you have to make to this matrix of distances in order to find the closest to find the closest metric. So that was actually the problem that started all of this. And once we realized that people were interested in, well, actually, people would ask us for this metric nearness problem and for sparse metric repair, they would ask us, well, what metric do you repair to? Could you repair to a certain kind of metric? And so that actually got us thinking, oh, maybe we want to do some sort of embedding or representation, or find the closest specific kind of metric, like a tree metric, or embed the points in some hyperbolic space. So find the set of distances in hyperbolic space that best represents the data. And also at the same time, folks in single cell sequencing were looking at hyperbolic representations of single cell data. And of course, people have done this for linguistics and social network analysis. And so we came up with an algorithm called TreeRep, which tries to find the best tree representation of your set of distances. And so I'll end here with this picture. So TreeRep goes from distances to tree structure, which you can then embed in, let's say, the Poincare disk. So this is like two-dimensional hyperbolic space. Hopefully it is useful for all sorts of tree-like data. So we're currently investigating its applications. Okay, and it is at this point that I'm going to stop and see if there are any more questions.
Anna, just checking, this is the end of the talk.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's thank Anna.
Yes. Thank you.
Because the way you phrased it, I wasn't quite sure. And any questions? Maybe I'll ask one quick one. But given that you don't actually assign any operational meaning to the nodes themselves, if a new data point arrived in your data set, and you have the metric that you've learned, and it's not necessarily, an L2 metric or it's not necessarily whatever, a Mahalanobis metric. There's no like explicit way to parameterize distances now that you don't know what that point actually represents.
Yeah.
Is there a way to think about this problem that's independent of just the data set you were given and assigning distances between those data sets?
I don't know. That's a good question. So like if I got a new point, like if I added a row and a column to my matrix, is there some way that I could, like jump up a dimension, so to speak, in my metric polytope and find, and sort of update my optimal point? I don't know. But that's a good question.
If there aren't any further questions, maybe we should thank Anna again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so the next session will be at 2. Awesome. Have a good lunch.